Thanks very much, Darren, and thanks both to Darren for inviting me and to everybody for coming and spending their lunch break listening to me. As Darren said, I'm just off the plane, so this is quite literally the returned immigrant, like off the plane, straight in to tell everybody about emigration. So this is like performance academia. So this talk is going to be about emigration since the crash in international and historical perspective. And I, as Darren said, am an economic and social historian, so I tend to look at, like a lot of historians, at everything in the past as a continuation of the present. And I also try, because the project that I work on, which is called Barriers to EU Citizenship, BEU Citizen, which is a European project, try to look at history in contemporary perspective as well as the other way around. So the project that I work on is an EU-funded project on the development of citizenship rights in Europe over the last 500 years. We have 10 different disciplinary groups working on the project, and I work on the first one listed there, the historical development of citizenship. We also have a huge number of social scientist colleagues working on citizenship in contemporary perspective, sociologists, legal scholars, economists, and anthropologists, and so on, looking at a number of issues which I think are particularly interesting to think about while we go through the information in this talk. To give you a little bit of background about the work that I myself do, our project looks at the historical development of citizenship since 1500 in Europe, so it's a very long-scale project, and I am responsible for Central German Europe during that period, so that's where my area of expertise is. And the way that that kind of intersects with my own sort of personal interest in emigration as a research topic is that one thing that is particularly important to understand about the part of the project that looks at Central Europe over the last 500 years is that citizenship rights in German Europe over that period are incredibly marked by an institution called the Wanderschaft, the wandering years, wherein there's basically built-in emigration into the job cycle of young people seeking to access economic and political rights, in the sense that you do your apprenticeship, and after you finish your apprenticeship, you go on a mandatory wandering period around different parts of your region, or indeed a wider area, before being able to take your mastership examination and become what we would think of as a full citizen with full economic and social rights, such as exist in wherever you choose to settle. So that was something that I try and keep in mind when thinking about my own immigration experience in historical perspective, because Ireland, of course, is somewhere that also has a sort of slightly de facto inbuilt emigration pattern over the last 200 years, in the sense that it's a recurring phenomenon to see young people going away to work, and some of them coming back later in life, and some of them not coming back later in life. So I'm bringing my own perspective, my own research into the research on this talk. And part of the sort of genesis of this particular research paper and the talk today is, in some ways, to be quite honest, frustration as an immigrant coming home every summer and at Christmas to be faced with an immigration debate which I think is often disappointingly superficial. I think that since the crash, we've got two kind of main narratives that have developed in the public discourse surrounding youth immigration. One is the kind of traditional "we can't all live on this small island" narrative, expounded by Michael Noonan's infamous comment that immigration could be seen as a lifestyle choice, which, let's be honest, could be quite true for some people like me who emigrated for work and so on. And the Taoiseach's recent comments that immigrants are staying away because they're worried about getting screwed on their taxes if they return, which you think might be sort of politically self-serving. Then the other narrative is a sort of doom and gloom narrative that seeks to exaggerate a serious problem to the point that it becomes taken less seriously, in the sense of the kind of headlines that we see in both the domestic and the international press. You know, The Guardian, at sort of low-end Irish emigration worse than the 1980s. The Irish Independent in 2011, immigration the highest since the 19th century. We're basically back in the famine in some of these narratives. On the Irish Independent, the Journal, the FT all picked up this idea that an Irish person emigrates every 6 minutes, which is a quite extraordinary way of expressing a statistic. And even amongst young people, you know, people my own age who might see immigration as a serious and infuriating topic, the main pressure group that has been founded by trade unions and student unions is called "We're Not Leaving," as if leaving is in some way a failure, sort of being a defeat for people. I think that the takeaway that I have from all of this every time that I come home and reading the press abroad is that despite centuries of emigration, Ireland's public debate and policy about immigration remains very disappointingly facile. We very rarely get beyond sound bites and headlines that don't actually tell us very much about either what's going on or why it's going on, and most importantly for the last part of this talk in terms of policy, which I know is something that everybody here is interested in working on, is that because of the facile nature of the debate, we really very rarely get to a point where we do anything about it or think in any way long term about how to live with immigration, manage immigration, and deal with immigration. So this talk is going to be in 4 parts. I'm going to talk about the immigration since the crash, so since 2008. Then we're going to look at that in historical context. Then we're going to look at it in international context, and we're going to look at it in policy context. And the idea of looking at these 3 different contexts really is that, as an economic and social historian on a project with a lot of social scientists working on contemporary issues, my role is kind of, and my colleagues' role in the historical branch of this project, is to be the kind of annoying person in the corner always saying, well, it's not quite that simple, or it wasn't always that way, much to the chagrin of a lot of colleagues who would like to have simpler narratives and say that everything is moving in a particular direction or not. As historians, we tend to always go for the kind of grey, ambiguous answer, so we're obsessed with context. But I'm going to try and bring that around to a policy focus to try and give us some sort of concrete ways to think about what these different types of context are telling us. So first, let's look at some of the numbers about immigration since the crash, just to see how big it is and to see the profile and the pattern of it. So that's part 1 of the talk. So here are the basic numbers of people emigrating from the country over the last 30 odd years. And as you can see, here we have this period which is historically very unusual for Ireland during the so-called boom years, the 2 different parts of the boom really, where emigration is very low, and then we have a very rapid spike after the crash. It really does go up very, very quickly, and in 2012 and 2013 we're looking at over 80,000 people a year leaving the country, and that number, despite the economic recovery, really hasn't gone down that much in the last 2 years. We wait. The classic historian's response here is it's too early to tell what happened to the French Revolution. This number could go down here, it could go up here, but I think that it's important for us not just to wait until we know the answer to the question before asking these questions. And I think that this is a very interesting phenomenon, this rapid spike. Sorry? Time? Oh, thousands of people emigrating. So here we have about 80 to 90,000 people emigrating in these peak years after the boom. So those are ostensibly quite large numbers, and those are the numbers that lead to the headlines that I referred to in one of the previous slides. And one thing that's really interesting about these numbers is how overwhelmingly young all of these people are. So the 2 bottom groups here, this line here is people under the age of 34 is calculated by Eurostat. The vast majority of these people are in their almost all of them are below 44, and huge numbers of them are in their 30s and 20s. Absolutely overwhelmingly so. And this is an issue that is not so important for people in these middle-aged and older age brackets, other than the fact that it's their children who are immigrating, obviously. So it's mainly people my and other students here age that have been emigrating since 2008 who make up the vast majority of these people. We're also particularly generally well educated, as Irish people are by international standards. Huge numbers of the people emigrating have 3rd level qualifications. Almost all of them have a leaving cert or at the end of a 2nd level qualification since 2008. You can see the number of people with 3rd level qualifications is possibly going up there. And we also have very large numbers by European standards of Irish students studying abroad, and that's obviously partially a reflection of our relationship with Britain and long-standing interaction between the higher education systems in the 2 islands. But by European standards, this is students studying abroad as a percentage of total students. The Irish number is very high. The only other countries really that it gets as high as are the smaller Eastern European countries where the university sector is much smaller. So young, pretty well educated is a profile. And if we look at the kind of economic status of these people, this is a graph of the different rates of unemployment since the crash. And as we can see, just like the immigration statistic, there's this big spike after the crash at the end of 2008. And it's quite interesting to look at the different layers of unemployment rate. There are different groups that were affected more by unemployment than others. Certainly the group that is most affected is young people, as you can see here. Very high rates of unemployment among young people, especially among young men. Very enormous numbers here of people leaving school who are unemployed. Not to the levels, as we'll discuss later, as in southern European countries, but still very large numbers nonetheless, much higher than the actual unemployment rate itself, which is something that's quite interesting in terms of explaining those previous graphs as to why so many of the people leaving are young people. But what's quite interesting is if you look at the way that this interacts with those previous graphs that we saw about the numbers of people leaving. So in the early years after the crash, you can see this is the percentage of immigrants whose status before they left is unemployed. So here it's higher than the unemployment rate quite considerably in 2010. So the unemployment rate in Ireland is around here. The unemployment rate amongst immigrants is much higher. But as the unemployment rate has come down, the unemployment rate amongst immigrants has actually gone down a lot more. So they're somewhat converging. So by 2015, actually quite a small proportion of people leaving were unemployed at the time they're choosing to leave. So we've seen that the numbers gone down slightly from peaks in 2012, 2013 of people leaving. But of those who are leaving since then, they are much more likely to have been in work or study before leaving. And we can see that in this graph here, which measures the different previous primary economic status of people emigrating since 2010. So as you can see, actually the largest group by far, and almost half of people in the year to April 2015, were actually people who were already in work when they decided to emigrate. So that's something I think that's quite interesting to think about, because a lot of the kind of superficial stereotype is people leaving because they are unemployed, because there is no work, whereas actually quite a lot of people are leaving while they do have work. It's obviously work that they are not satisfied with. It's obviously work that they think they can have greater opportunities elsewhere, but nonetheless that's quite interesting. And you also see this increase in the numbers who were students, and that's something that we can think about in historical perspective a little bit later in the talk. But as we see, the numbers who were unemployed before they left going down, the numbers who were in work quite high, and the numbers who were in study going up. So I think that that's quite interesting in terms of thinking about the kind of general stereotype that we have about the reasons why people are leaving. Not that we necessarily should assume from the status that people had that that's a reason why they're leaving. As we'll discuss later, there are many different reasons for leaving. So, yeah.
The immigrant numbers include immigrants who have one?
Yes, I have a graph on that. That's in a couple of slides, yes. So that is obviously important to think about, is the nationality of these people, what their nationality is, and whether they came to this country for work and so on. So we'll have a look at that in a sec. So as I said, it's important not to just read into hard numbers like these the reasons why people chose to leave, because it's often quite difficult. I mean, even if you ask 100 immigrants why they left, they might get 100 different answers, and they might not easily fit in a spreadsheet. I left for graduate study. I didn't expect to leave permanently, but then I didn't also plan definitely to come back either. So it's not quite as simple. And I think that a really interesting piece of research that was done at UCC, the Emigration report that was quite widely noticed in 2013, is a survey where they asked thousands of immigrants to explain to them why they had chosen to leave. So you have to take some of these numbers with a grain of salt in the sense that obviously there are selection biases and so on. But what's quite interesting is the numbers are not very simple. And in fact, the categories can be quite difficult, as I said in my own experience. The categories can be quite difficult to disentangle. So, lots of people are leaving because they say they want to find a job. But then again, lots of people say that they're leaving because they want to travel. But that, they are generally going to work while they're away as well. People wanting to get job experience, what does that necessarily mean? There are lots of different reasons why people might make the decision. They might not be individual decisions. But I think that what's quite interesting is the way that this changes from people who were leaving at sort of the end of the boom to afterwards. So the return of people leaving for employment reasons, I think, is the big story there. Because during the boom, when immigration was very low, most people who were leaving, who were Irish especially, were people who wanted to travel. So people leaving as, you might even say, as a lifestyle choice to experience life elsewhere. This is the kind of emigration that people might say, well, it will always be with us because some people want to go elsewhere. Whereas very few people were leaving for work, whereas that obviously changes considerably once the employment situation and the economy overall deteriorates. So as Kevin said, it's important to think about whether or not lots of the people leaving are people who had come here, for example, during the boom as immigrants, because there was a very good employment situation, especially relative to, for example, the accession countries from Eastern Europe and the EU. Whether or not lots of people leaving are former immigrants, and how emigration and immigration interplay. I think there's a number of interesting things if we look at these numbers. So these are thousands of people in these different categories over the last number of years. And obviously the most noticeable thing that you see is this huge fall off in the number of people immigrating to Ireland. So we had very high immigration in the last years of the boom up to 2007, 2008, and that really just falls off a cliff when the crash happens. The numbers go down enormously. And obviously the number of people leaving goes up both for Irish people and for non-Irish people. And the interplay of those two things is very interesting. But I think another thing that's very interesting about this graph is if we look at the kind of category that we might think about less here, which is the number of Irish people immigrating into Ireland, so what we might think of as returned immigrants. And that number is going down the whole time. So even though Irish emigration is starting to fall, even though the economy is starting to pick up, considerably fewer people are immigrating into Ireland who are Irish than were doing so in 2008, 2009, 2010, and so on. The number is really not beginning to pick up. So emigrant return, if we'd like to think of it like that, is lagging both the fall in emigration, which is here, the return of immigration of non-Irish people, which we can see is going back up again, is driving the net immigration statistic we can look at later, and also is lagging economic recovery. So I think this is a really interesting number to keep our eye on over the next couple of years, is whether that number starts to tick back up again. Because obviously there are lots of Irish people who have left, all of these people here. We don't know how long they're going to stay away for. A lot of the conventional wisdom is, sure, they'll come back. Every time you come home from abroad, when you're living abroad, some relative or friend asks you, when are you going to come home? And I think that's a question that we're asking on a macro level as well. And I think that it's especially important to think of in terms of, do we want these people to come home, and how much are we willing to do to encourage them to come home? And what ways can we think about that? So we'll think about that in the policy context a bit towards the end. So if we look at the nationality purely of net migration, you can see that they actually go together quite a lot since the crash. So Irish people and non-Irish people have behaved in quite similar ways over the last number of years in terms of choosing to leave. And the numbers of them leaving and coming into the country, the numbers of them leaving are actually very similar. In fact, they're almost identical since 2010, which we can have a look at in a minute. So you can see that the net migration figure for Irish people, has fallen a lot. The net migration for non-Irish overall has fallen a lot because of the fall off in immigration of especially EU citizens, and the numbers are somewhat tracking each other at the moment, especially over the last 5 years. Another thing to think about is the gender of these people. And one thing that I think is really interesting is that there is a very pronounced gender difference in the numbers of people leaving. So this is male emigrants per female emigrant since 2008, both for Irish and for non-Irish. And as you can see, all the way through, there are more male emigrants than there are female immigrants. So as we saw earlier, the unemployment rate amongst young men is higher than the unemployment rate amongst young women. They got hit hardest, especially in the early years where unemployment spiked for young men, so that might have something to do with it. There could be all sorts of different reasons. I think that that's really important to think about, because this is, especially amongst Irish people, very noticeable. The numbers amongst non-Irish people are much more variable. There are some years where there are more women coming, there are some years where there are more men coming, and that is affected a lot by different types of immigrant inflows, so whether they're coming from the EU, whether they're coming from outside the EU, and so on. Whereas amongst Irish people leaving, we have a consistent surfeit of men leaving relative to women over the last few years, which I think is interesting and something to keep in mind when thinking about immigration in the public debate. So what are the takeaways of all that on a very sort of simple level for people leaving since the crash? Well, they're overwhelmingly young. Most of them are either in work or education, so most of them are not unemployed, and the number of them who are unemployed are going down, so they're increasingly less likely to have been unemployed before leaving. They're pretty well educated. They're more male than female, and since May 2009, the numbers of people who are Irish and non-Irish who are emigrating are almost identical. Absolutely 50-50. So half the immigration number since that time is Irish and half of it is non-Irish, and we can probably assume that most of the non-Irish are immigrants into the country. Some of them will not be, obviously, but I think the majority of them probably are, which gives us a net migration figure since then, which is quite considerable. So we're losing quite a lot of people. So those are the sort of basics of post-crash immigration, and as I said, we're going to have a look at these in 3 different contexts just to see about how that might affect how we think about them and how we might think about them going forward. So the first one is going to be to look at it in historical context, just to see, obviously there's a tendency in public debate and in media debate about this to compare to times previous, a sort of arms race of, we've reached the highest number since, year X. It's getting as bad as the famine or whatever. And so I think it's important to try and look at this in the very, very long run. So this is annual net migration by inter-census period since 1871 in thousands. So as you can see, this doesn't look great down here after 2008. It's looks like something that we're maybe back to the late 80s in terms of the number of people who are leaving. It's certainly not anywhere near as bad as the numbers in the 19th century in terms of the net loss, because what we still have in the post-2008 period is we still have people coming into the country. So a lot of the, as we said, I saw in the previous slide, the numbers leaving are much larger than the actual net loss, because there's still people coming into the country, which is obviously important for the labour market and for the population. But there's, over the long run, there's less immigration in Ireland, but you still have these periodic slumps, the 1880s, the 1950s, the 1980s, and again after the crash. And this, in terms of raw numbers, isn't looking that good compared to some of these other periods, but it's certainly nowhere near as bad as some of these numbers down here in terms of the net loss to the country. If we adjust that for 1,000 average population, obviously that changes it slightly because the population of Ireland is, has been increasing over the last number of decades, so that does make the situation a little bit more reflective. And what we can see is that when adjusted for population, the number for the post-crash period hasn't actually quite gotten as bad as in that year of the 1980s in terms of net loss of people per year, and it's obviously significantly less bad than these numbers way back here in the 19th century and the 1950s. But that's not to say that this is not, a serious fall in the net migration rate, even proportionally speaking, and that's not something very important. It's extremely important, especially because, in terms of economic growth, Ireland has done very well here, less well here, and suddenly is doing much better, but the numbers are not looking good in terms of people leaving the country. So in terms of history of just raw numbers of net migration, we're not quite as bad as the 1980s, definitely not as bad as the 1950s or the 19th century, but at the same time, there's lots of periods in here, even after the foundation of the state, where the net migration figure was better than it is in the post-crash period. What about the age profile of immigrants? Is that unusual in historical context? And I think the answer here is no. So we've got some periods here and the net migration amongst 15 to 34-year-olds. As we saw in the slides for post-crash immigration, the vast majority of them are under 34. And here we have this number expressed as a percentage of total net migration. And you can see that in most of these periods, it's overwhelmingly so. In the 50s, it's a very large majority, and the rest of it is coming from people who are 35 to 44, so not necessarily young, but early middle age. In the 1960s, the numbers leaving in the young group far exceed the actual net migration figure, because there's net immigration for children and for the elderly. So in this period, it's very highly characterized by net immigration amongst young people. The same in the 70s, even though the figure is very low. Again, there's net immigration overall, but we still had a loss of 11,300 15 to 34-year-olds in net terms. and the 1980s again, we have, the number, the net migration number is exactly the same as the net migration amongst 15 to 34-year-olds, because the net migration amongst other groups, so children, middle-aged and older, is flat. So it's not unusual at all over the last 60, 70 years for the majority of Irish immigration to be young people. So we're not in a historically unusual situation, that being the case post-2008. But you could say it's quite interesting that that didn't change, in the sense that people obviously theoretically would have more choices now than they did back then, and yet people are still leaving very young. In terms of gender, the picture is a bit more mixed, and there's been some great work done on this over the years, trying to look at different periods and their gender makeup in emigration. And as we saw post-2008, there's a very extensive male bias, which there is in some periods, so like in the 1980s, more males than females. But there are other periods where there were more women than men emigrating, in the 1950s, or in the 1960s, for example, and in some periods in the early 20th century, there were more women net leaving the country than there were men net leaving the country. So there's a more mixed pattern in historical context there. We're not seeing a simple continuation of a long-term pattern. The pattern has actually shifted during different waves of emigration. So this particular wave is being characterized by male bias, which is similar again to the 1980s as we saw it was in number terms. If we look at it in terms of region, and this is something that I, as somebody from the west of the country, tend to think about, we have two different, in these next two slides, two different county sets for net migration on an annual basis, adjusted for population. And as you can see, there is, between the two slides, so these are what you might think of as eastern and what we now think of as maybe eastern commuter counties. And these ones here are more western, southern, more remote counties. Quite a similar line, so a similar national pattern. In all the periods that Ireland is doing badly, there's people leaving most of the counties in relatively similar numbers. But what's quite interesting is that during certain growth periods, so for example, during the Celtic Tiger boom, there's a lot higher net immigration in the east of the country than there was in some of these counties in the west. So some of these places, Kerry, Mayo, etc., didn't do so well in terms of net immigration during the boom period. And it remains to be seen, because obviously we don't have a census until next year to get answers to some of these questions, how they have fared during the boom. Is boom immigration more westernly biased? Is an interesting question to think about, and a very interesting policy question to think about if that's still the case, that we still have a Western problem in terms of immigration. But I think that's the interesting thing here, is the much lower peaks in terms of net immigration for the counties in the west and the counties in the east of that period. And then in terms of education, this is a table from somebody who is here. The 1980s brain drain, part of the public debate in the 1980s was how many people were, as I showed in a cartoon, post-2008 cartoon in the title slide, the idea of people graduating from school or college and getting straight on the plane, the idea that we were losing very educated young people. And from school leaver surveys, the numbers in the late 80s were, quite depressingly high in terms of the number of people who were leaving straight from finishing, their types of education. And we don't have the data to exactly know that now, but from the fact that we know that large and increasing numbers of people since 2008 were in study before leaving, we can see that there is perhaps a similar pattern starting to take place there. So what might the historical context tell us about the post-2008 period emigration in sort of headline terms? Historically, immigration has been higher than it is in the current period, but that's not necessarily, cause for celebration or anything. There are periods when it was comparably low, the 1980s, for example, 1926 to 36, and indeed it's higher proportionally now than it was in some semi-growth periods in the past. It has been for a very long time overwhelmingly young. It's almost always been an age profile that's biased towards the under 35s, but it didn't have a single gender division as post-2008 immigration has. There was a national pattern sort of overall, but there are regional differences, and it'll be interesting to see as the next couple of years go on whether some of those regional differences are repeated in the emigration statistics in Western counties since 2008 and since the 2011 census especially. And in the 1980s, immigrants were increasingly well educated and were increasingly coming from people who had just or recently finished school or college, which is something that is observed today as well. So the headline I would say is young people leaving the island is a persistent phenomenon for Ireland, but it's not as simple as to say immigration is back to the 1980s or immigration is back to the 1950s or immigration is back to the 19th century, because there are different patterns for these different periods which are important to keep in mind in terms of analysing. What about internationally? So if, one thing that I think we're very good at in this country is thinking about ourselves as, and this is true of most countries, certainly as a historian working in Britain, there's no subject at all that you don't see couched as the story of Britain itself. The kind of insularity of thinking that your story is a unique story is one that is common across lots of different cultures, and certainly I think it's true of our immigration public debate. But how true is that? How unusual are we in international terms? So in European terms, we are quite unusual. So here we have the laggard pigs countries with their immigrant numbers per thousand population, so adjusted so that we can compare them between the different countries. And we can see Ireland, since the crash, has a much higher rate of emigration than these other countries. And this is something that people anecdotally talk about as well. The young Spaniards, young Italians, young Greeks, young Portuguese, even though they have even worse youth unemployment figures, for example, than people in Ireland, simply don't emigrate as much as Irish people. There could be, historical culture reasons for that. There could be language reasons for that. But it is true to say that compared to the other kind of back-of-the-class Eurozone states since the crash, Irish people have emigrated in proportionately higher numbers. And that's also pretty much true if we look at EU states of comparable size to Ireland. So, those other states are much larger than Ireland, so that could be one reason why maybe they emigrate less. These are states roughly the same size as Ireland, and the only ones again that we are comparable to are, for example, Lithuania here, a small Eastern European country which is much less developed than Ireland, whereas these other EU states that are roughly the same population as Ireland, much lower proportional rates of emigration. So we are internationally quite unusual in that sense. But I think it's, and the other thing to say is that we are also quite unusual in having such a youth profile for our emigration. Emigration from a lot of Eastern European countries like Poland, here is the number under 29 in 2013. In a lot of the larger Eastern European countries, this number is relatively small compared to Ireland, because you have a lot more working middle-aged people who are emigrating or did immigrate, for example. That was something that definitely characterised Eastern European immigration during the boom period here. Whereas Ireland's number is way out in front. Again, Lithuania, quite similar, but compared to a lot of European states, for our immigration to be so heavily dominated by people in their 20s and 30s is quite unusual. But what if we think about states a little bit closer to home, or non-states, as the case may be? I thought it might be quite interesting to think about in international context, comparing our immigration numbers to Scotland. And obviously, immigration here has to be, maybe I should perhaps put that in quotation marks. I'm sure that Nicola Sturgeon would count people going to live in the rest of the UK as immigration, but the Office of National Statistics in England might not. But these numbers do include the number of Scots going to live in the rest of the UK, because they do count that. And they don't have, Scotland's population is quite similar to, relatively similar to Ireland, and there are quite high numbers in raw terms, and they're quite young. So perhaps some similarities there which are interesting to think about. But the vast majority of them are going to live in the rest of the UK. So if we think about that compared to Ireland, here are similar statistics for Ireland so that we can compare. The raw numbers in Ireland are slightly higher. The numbers, the youth profile is slightly higher, slightly lower. In other words, people are a little bit younger. And we go much less to the UK. So even though they have, in terms of rate per thousand, they're not that far away from us. They're certainly a lot higher than a lot of other European states in terms of people leaving, Scotland, in quotation marks, as a state. But they're not quite as high as us. And what's very interesting is that if we think of this in kind of, economic historians love natural experiments. So I'm sure that there will be some of my colleagues here who would be immediately looking at these graphs being like, well, Ireland left the UK, Scotland didn't leave the UK, that's interesting. And actually, I think perhaps it is interesting, although it's not quite as simplistic as saying that our independence is what causes this figure. But it's interesting that their immigration is overwhelmingly to the UK, whereas even though lots of Irish people go to the UK, the percentage going is much lower, even though that is our #1 destination. But I still think it's interesting to think about the similarities in some ways between Ireland and Scotland, and also to think about the differences. Another country that often people think about as a kind of natural similarity to Ireland is all the way on the other side of the world in New Zealand. Little bit of a different geographical relationship in the sense that we are right on the edge of a very large continent which is heavily populated, whereas they are quite a ways off a continent which is not very well populated. But they actually do have an immigration profile which is not dissimilar to our own, although it does have some very important differences. So in terms of raw number, New Zealand's population and our population, again, are actually very, very similar, more similar than Scotland's. In terms of raw numbers, there are a number of years after the crash where the numbers are quite similar to the numbers in Ireland. Their proportion who are New Zealanders leaving as opposed to non-New Zealanders leaving, so in other words, immigrants who have, as Kevin put it, had enough or decided to move on, are higher than the Irish numbers that we have. But again, interesting in the sense that there are those two groups and that the home group do make up at least half. And in terms of proportional leaving, there's a period here after the economic crash where their numbers are relatively similar proportionately to ours. But what again is quite interesting in terms of New Zealand, similar to Scotland, is the relationship that they have to Australia, in the sense that that is not only the preferred destination, so the equivalent to the UK for us, but actually it's much more similar to the equivalent to the UK for Scotland, because over half of New Zealand immigrants are going to live in Australia. So again, we're still quite unusual. It's difficult to find somewhere that's exactly like us. But if we think about it, there are actually some small countries who do have some similarities, which I think are interesting to think about in terms of contextualizing our immigration experience in an international context. So the overview of that for the international context would be that our immigration is unusually high by the standard of the other worst performing and most crisis hit European Eurozone states. It is unusually high by the standards of other small EU states. It is unusually young by EU standards, despite the youth unemployment level in European countries being much worse in some cases. Their immigration rate still doesn't come close to ours. And there are some similarities and some dissimilarities with Scotland and New Zealand, which I think are interesting to think about in terms of contextualizing our experience. But that said, Ireland's youth immigration is unusual in international context. So there is something special about our history and culture of immigration, or particular conditions in Ireland, which are causing a higher youth immigration rate than comparable states, economically, size-wise, and geographically. So in terms of thinking about those contexts conceptually, I think the one thing that's really interesting is trying to push mental pictures together of what immigration means for Ireland in ways that are understandable for people. So one thing that I always find really interesting going home and talking to people about immigration as a Kerryman is lots of Western counties, despite population growth and economic growth over the last 100 years, are still smaller in population terms than they were at the beginning of the state and the beginning of the 20th century. So we're still at a net loss for Kerry, Mayo, and lots of other places in the West compared to 100 years ago, and coming up to the centenary of 1916, etc. I'm sure that will be something that is latched onto by some people, and I think it is something that's very interesting. I think what's also very interesting is the dominance of certain places in our immigration experience over the last 100 years. If we think about the Irish population of London, if that was a city, it would be the third biggest city in Ireland after, well, depending on your view on the national question, Dublin and Belfast or Dublin and Cork, which is quite interesting. And that's something that is not mirrored in conurbation terms by our comparisons with Scotland and New Zealand. Their biggest exile cities are London for Scotland, but it would only be the 9th biggest urban area in Scotland. And Brisbane is the biggest New Zealand expat or immigrant community, and that would only be the 8th biggest city in New Zealand. So that's something that's quite interesting. London is still, that number exemplifies two things. Number one, how many young Irish people still go to London and have gone to London over a long period, but also how unbalanced our own urban development has been, in the sense that lots of places in the country really haven't developed as much. And even if you take the Irish-born population of England, that would be the third biggest province in Ireland. It would be bigger than Connacht if you count people from Northern Ireland and Ireland who are living in England, which is another interesting way of thinking about the statistics. But our diaspora in that way is not necessarily internationally that unusual, in the sense that the New Zealand-born population of Australia is roughly the same as the Irish state-born population of Great Britain, so people born in the Irish Republic living in England, Wales and Scotland. So that's quite interesting in the sense that it's not totally unusual to have a kind of big brother where you have a large immigrant or expat community. But one thing that is interesting, and I don't say this in any kind of hardline Republican way, but it is interesting to think about in terms of conceptualizing our immigration experiences. The population of the Irish state is, roughly 4.6 million. The population of Northern Ireland and the population of Irish people living in Britain is 2.4 million. So in Reflection 2016 terms, as I'm sure there'll be a lot of hand-wringing next year, the number of people living in the jurisdiction next to us who are born on the island of Ireland is very high compared to the number of people living in the Irish state, which is something I think that's really important to think about in both policy terms and just in terms of conceptualizing our own nationhood. So finally,
the comparison with New Zealand is interesting because in Ireland you have lots of choice. Right? Other countries you can go to, okay, a lot of them aren't English speaking, whereas New Zealand, Australia is 4 hours away, and then where do you go?
Yeah.
It's Timor or somewhere. So that needs to be kind of taken into account.
Yeah. Well, I think that what's interesting, if you consider Ireland, Scotland, and New Zealand together in that context, is that Scots do have a wider range of choices like Irish people do geographically, but those who choose to leave Scotland choose to go to the rest of the UK. Whereas Irish people make a much wider range of choices. And obviously those choices have shifted over time. In the 19th century there was a very heavy bias to the US, and then there's a more heavy bias to the UK. And I think the interplay of the labour markets in Britain and Ireland obviously makes a big difference there, and the fact that you can, like I did this morning, go back and forth quite as easily. I think that's really important to keep in mind, because as you say, New Zealanders have less choice. Their second biggest expat community is in Britain, which is on the other side of the world, and is much smaller than their community in Australia. So that's, I think, very interesting in terms of the ways.
It's bigger now than the World Cup.
Sorry?
It's bigger now than the World Cup.
It is, and London is full of both, or at least they've all come out of the woodwork anyway, and you can hear the accents everywhere. So the final part, so I'm just going to wrap up in a sec, just these are kind of more suggestions for discussion and thought than they are particular sort of policy prescriptions. But in terms of the last slide, in terms of just conceptualizing ourselves as a nation which involves lots of people living outside of the state, obviously as somebody who works on citizenship, I think that that's something that's really important to keep in mind. And in terms of the policy implications, I think that there are two things that I would definitely want as takeaways. So this is kind of more of a rant than anything more quantifiable. But as a young Irish person living abroad, that's kind of a major narrative amongst my circle of friends, people that I know, and even similar people who I meet, is this idea that Ireland is still somewhat a seniority society, that every time a crash hits Ireland, the young people leave, the older middle-aged people don't leave, and that really we are made to carry the can, both at home and abroad, for things that happen in Ireland. That could be true or not. It's certainly a resentment that many young people feel. And there are many headline figures that you see when reading the papers or when reading research that as a young person reinforce that idea for you. The idea that, because of the seniority and also the hiring freeze, the civil service is rapidly aging, very few young people getting into the civil service. Huge numbers of young teachers on temporary contracts because schools won't hire on a permanent basis, putting them at a severe disadvantage compared to some of their older colleagues in pay and conditions terms, and even at the beginning of the boom, some of the unions being willing to sacrifice conditions for newer entrants to preserve conditions for existing workers. Quite high immigration amongst skilled professions like doctors and nurses, who have been protesting about the working conditions for junior doctors and nurses in Ireland over the last number of years, especially in comparison to people perhaps higher up the pay chain. Public sector cuts which focused on new entrants, as I said, the job bridge scheme, a particular kind of annoyance for young people. I was talking to a young woman recently who's training to be a psychotherapist, who could could only find jobs on JobBridge being advertised to do training in Ireland. And there are other statistics that make it look pretty bad as well. Youth welfare payments were cut much quicker than welfare payments for people over the age of 26 after the crash, and our rate of people who I hate this phrase, needs, but the number of people who are not in education, employment, or training in Ireland is above the OECD average, despite the fact that we're a very young country and generally a very well-educated country. That's not necessarily something that you would expect. And I think that a lot of this kind of resentment that young people feel, and a lot of these factors to do with especially public sector and public policy, are in many ways at odds with Ireland's brand as the youngest country in Europe, and especially with kind of public pronouncements from politicians and social leaders talking about trying to lower youth immigration and attracting returns. The question that I think a lot of young immigrants ask themselves is, people get very sad at Christmas when the people come home and they see the reports from Dublin Airport, but in terms of money in their pocket, what kind of sacrifices would they be willing to make to try and attract young people home in a way that doesn't just include across-the-board tax cuts, as perhaps the government might, basically the main idea that the government came up with so far to tempt young people home. So I think that's an important thing to think about in terms of, why are young people leaving this young, vibrant country? Does it have something to do with their perceptions or the reality of the opportunity that they have, especially because so many of them who are leaving actually did have work and thus, are not leaving purely out of what might simplistically be referred to as necessity. The other thing is going back to what I was talking about a moment ago, which is the idea of an Ireland which exists outside the Irish state. I think that part of the takeaway from this research and from my talk today is really how long our immigrant experience has been, how persistent a feature it is of our national story, and that if immigration is going to remain a persistent feature of Irish society, which perhaps we may think it does. There was a lot of talk during the boom years that immigration was dead and gone, that was never going to come back, which has proved not to be the case. If that is going to be a persistent feature, I think that we need to reconceptualize how we think of our nation, in the sense that it shouldn't end at the water's edge or at the border's edge. And one thing that's really interesting about countries that have large diaspora populations like New Zealand and other countries is that they do have things that we do not have, like absentee voting and representation for people who live abroad, something that the government has been very slow to take any action on over the last 6 years despite immigration coming back. And we also, from my own perspective as somebody working on citizenship, have had an incredibly simplistic debate about the conception of Irish citizenship. We went from the kind of 1980s, 1990s approach of sort of giving Irish citizenship to anybody who was willing to set up a factory or, in some cases, give a politician a few grand, to a very heavily restricted citizenship law brought in by referendum, on a limited empirical basis, which has now made our citizenship quite restrictive to people who come here to work, in the sense that being born here doesn't automatically give you citizenship. Yet at the same time, there are still people sitting over in Boston who, because of an immigrant grandfather or grandmother, do have citizenship or can claim citizenship. I think that if we're going to see this kind of persistent youth immigration and diaspora, we need to rethink how these both citizenship law and citizenship rights work for young people. And I think that the final thing to think about is we're going to have a lot of national reflection next year. As a historian, I think that you always dread an anniversary, but also look forward to it in the sense that it means that people will pay attention to your work as a historian, but you also dread the horribly twisted ways that history will be portrayed in political and media terms. I think we're already seeing that, the way that 1916 is being sort of squabbled over by political parties. But I think that if we were to think about a sort of grand question for 2016 is to try and answer this persistent, can we all live on this small island question? I think that's a question we often ask, but we don't often try and answer. And if we do want to be able to have a country where people behave in a more European fashion, in the sense that people don't emigrate as a kind of first resort when things get bad, that's not to say that that's a good or a bad thing. Obviously, as somebody who left, I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. But if we do want to think about that, we need to think about what kind of Ireland that we want to build. I think that over the last 10 or 15 years, these questions haven't been asked, and the return of immigration and this anniversary give us perhaps an opportunity to ask some of these questions. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thanks.
Thank you for a very comprehensive